All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our Research and Winemaking webinar series. Thanks for being with us today. We hope you will enjoy this webinar and will develop knowledge and learn new skills to be used in your vineyard and winery. So I'm Dr. Aude Waterloo, an assistant professor of enology in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition at Iowa State University. And I'm co-hosting this webinar with my friend and colleague, Drew Horton, who is a research specialist of enology at the University of Minnesota's Grape Breeding and Enology Project. So before starting the webinar, here are a few instructions. The webinar is currently being recorded, and the recording is going to be available on YouTube in about 2 weeks. The recording of the previous webinars is already available on YouTube, so you can scan the QR code or I would say click on the link, but the link won't work, to have access to those recordings. If you have any questions during all the presentation, please use the chat box. That's this sign that you can find at the bottom of your screen by clicking on the 3 dots. And we will answer your questions at the end of the 2 presentations. So today we have 2 presentations. First, you will hear from Dr. Gavin Sacks, who will present the roles of sulfur dioxide and pH in wine to protect against microbial spoilage and oxidation for about half an hour. After that, Chris Gerling from Cornell University, both are from Cornell University, will present the winery operations for headspace management of tanks and other containers for about 15 to 20 minutes. After these 2 presentations, we will respond to questions and have a panel discussion with a couple of winemakers, including Dorothy O'Brien from Wide River Winery in Iowa and Kevin Fifo from Covered Bridges Winery in Iowa. But let's start by the introduction and presentation of Chris Gerling.
Pardon me, I think it's going to be me, Gavin.
Gavin, yeah,
first.
sorry.
Gavin, oh, sorry.
I know.
Yeah.
Oh, that's not your fault. We switched on you at the last minute.
We changed.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, very good.
So before you start, Gavin, I'm just going to introduce you.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
So Dr. Sacks is a professor and associate chair of food science at Cornell University. He has a PhD in chemistry for Cornell University. His research interests are in developing and utilizing state-of-the-art approaches to analysis of trace level components associated with food and beverage quality, with a special focus on mass spectrometry-based tools. He teaches courses related to wine flavor chemistry and analysis and has co-authored a textbook on wine chemistry. And I think actually now there's 2 textbooks on wine chemistry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the first and second, the second edition corrects all the things that were wrong in the first edition. So you can compare the 2.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, thank you. And also, bad news, Aude. I was recently changed over from being associate chair to chair. So I now have even more. Thank you. Even more. Yeah. And even more committee meetings. Good. Well, thank you, Aude and Drew, for the invitation to speak. And thank you for those in the audience out there in WebEx land for joining me on what I'm sure it must be a really busy time of your harvest or pre-harvest season there in Iowa and Minnesota. So we switched it up, Chris and I. My research
Gavin, can you make it in full screen, please?
Yes. Is it showing in full screen now? It is on my screen.
Not yet.
Not still?
No, it's still not full screen.
Interesting. I can try this again, but I am now on full screen on my own screen. It says, yeah, let me think. Yeah. Hey, Chris, what are you seeing? You seeing?
I see it in slide outline mode still. There may be one
bizarre.
more click you have to do somewhere that
Okay. I do not know where that other click would be. Because it is, yeah, it's full screen on my screen right now.
Or can you share the
Let's
other
see here.
screen
So media
where it's
controls, monitor, primary monitor. Let's try this again. I'm going to try. How about now?
nope. Can you share the other screen where it's
Oh,
in full screen on your
I only
side?
have one screen.
Oh.
I'm taking off presenter mode. How about this?
Maybe you have to close your presentation and reopen to have
Okay.
just in one screen, like full screen, one screen. So if you reopen your presentation and
Yeah,
try sharing again.
Trying to find my presentation now. Okay, so I'm going to try. No, this isn't going to work. Very strange. Okay, I'm going to try closing the presentation completely. Give me just a moment and
Yep.
reopening it. Um, okay, and how's that?
It's still not full screen.
Let's see. Well, hey, Chris, are my slides on yours? Media controls, slideshow.
Otherwise, you can just expand if you don't see, like if you don't
Yeah,
find the
I can try.
slideshow.
Well, then I can just
expand.
do it from not presentation mode.
Yeah, that way it works.
Minimize.
That is good
Better?
now. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
How about that? Okay. Yeah, we'll try this. Good. So no animations, but you don't need animations. Hey, where were we? So we have me starting off before Chris, because I'm going to talk about some of the more theoretical aspects of the role of oxygen and sulfur dioxide and pH during wine storage. I'm going to discuss this a little bit also before finished wine, but the reason to focus on these three components, pH, oxygen, SO2, is that the microbial changes that can occur during wine and also the abiotic, that is those changes that are not going to involve microbes, all of these processes are dependent on those big three things, pH, oxygen, SO2. And often on all three of them. Those three can interact. So the idea of focusing management of wines in bulk storage on pH and oxygen and SO2 makes a lot of sense because of their role in how a wine ages. Chemically, I haven't seen a good definition of age-worthy. I don't know if enologists have described this. I suspect Jancis Robinson probably has some ideas of what it means, but this is the definition that I use, which is something that we could test for. If we have two wines, A and B, and we like them equally at some time point, then wine A ages better if we like it more than B at some later time point. We're commenting on, I mean, this is a relative term to say age worthy. We're comparing its ability to be liked more after some amount of time than another wine. And there's a couple of ways I can imagine this happening. One is that maybe both wine A and wine B had desirable characteristics early on when they were young, but they're more stable in wine A. Or it could be that we make fewer undesirable things in wine A as we age it. Another possibility, you get the Yoda-like wisdom with the wine, new show up. We could be losing undesirable sensory compounds more quickly, or we could be forming more desirable compounds. All of these could result in a wine that's better liked after some amount of time, but they're going to involve different types of reactions. The common thread, though, for the reactions that can occur to make a wine more or less age-worthy during storage is going to be determined by what's in wine. And wine is mostly water and ethanol at a low pH. It's water, ethanol, and acidic conditions that's buffered to a pH of 3 or 4. And most of these reactions are going to be happening at around room temperature, 20 degrees Celsius. Under these conditions, almost all the reactions that are happening fall into one of three categories. They're either going to involve the loss or the gain of water or ethanol. And these are often acid catalyzed, that is at lower pH, higher acid, higher H plus concentration. These reactions are going to go faster. They could involve oxidation, to the reaction of oxygen with wine components, and then subsequent reactions that often involve SO2. And then finally, we can have reactions that require the presence of microorganisms, which are almost always dependent on pH, SO2, and oxygen. And that's the common theme for reactions that are going to happen during wine storage. What's the pH? What's your SO2? What's your oxygen concentration? So going way back to the beginning, when you just have grape juice, when you've got must, oxygen can have a role then too, but it's very short-lived. If you have a dissolved oxygen meter and you take freshly crushed grapes and shake it up until it's saturated, okay, so a quick terminology review, air saturation. There is a limit to how much oxygen we can dissolve into a wine or a juice. Typically, the higher what we observe is the higher the temperature, the lower the solubility. This is the opposite of things like salt and sugar, solids. When temperature increases, the solubility of a gas decreases. And in the case of oxygen, we can't get very much into it, into a wine or a juice. The solubility is going to be somewhere in the ballpark of 10 milligrams per liter, 10 parts per million, after which if you're in the presence of air, after which we can't increase the solubility of oxygen further. And if you're doing something like using aeration devices, you can achieve about the same effect just by pouring the wine back and forth between a couple of glasses a few times. There's a limit to how much air you can cram into a wine or into a juice, unless that oxygen in that air is being consumed by something. It's reacting with something. Once we've hit that point where we can't get any more oxygen to dissolve, we've hit saturation. So if you saturate a fresh grape must, bring it up to around 8 to 10 milligrams per liter of concentration, within a few minutes, you won't be able to measure any oxygen. At least not if there's any, at least if you have no SO2 presence. Grapes, like most fruits and vegetables, contain enzymes which can cause browning reactions. And you can see this if you've got a unsulfited grape must and you add an oxygen, you will see browning. And it's the same enzymes in grapes that are also found in bananas and in apples and potatoes. They're going to cause these browning reactions. These same enzymes or related enzymes can also be found in certain microorganisms, including botrytis. What these have in common is that they will very rapidly consume oxygen. And within a few minutes, you can go from saturation to almost undetectable levels of oxygen in freshly crushed grapes or in fresh juice. If there's if there's SO2 present, these reactions will slow down and they may even stop completely. Lacase from botrytis is not affected quite so much, but the grape enzymes are affected more by sulfite. And this is something then that's common then for winemakers to do, is to add SO2 early on, because that must looks kind of ugly, right, when it's brown. But the actual threat to the wine from early oxygen additions ends up being pretty minor. You can take intentionally oxidized grape must. This looks like molasses up here. This is hyperoxidized or intentionally oxidized must, no SO2 from Chardonnay. If you then put that through fermentation, that will start to reverse. And what you have at the end of fermentation is something that looks an awful lot like the original grape juice. Many of those brown products that are formed from oxidation, those can be reversed, both some of the flavor changes, but also some of the color changes as well. Fermentation is a strongly reducing environment. Reducing or reductive is the opposite of oxidation, and it can reverse many of those reactions that occurred. And so with work that's been done on the effects of pre-fermentation, exposure to must, sometimes people can find differences. Sometimes they're there. They're often real small, and they're not very consistent from study to study. And so the impact of oxygen early on, unless it's facilitating microbial spoilage, that impact of oxygen early on ends up being pretty small. The same thing goes for actively fermented wine. If you saturate a must with, a fermenting wine with fermenting must with oxygen, yeast enzymatic activity will very quickly either consume the oxygen or the CO2 that's getting produced will sparge it out, push it out of the tank. And again, you can start with saturation of oxygen, 8-10 milligrams per liter, and within a few minutes, you'll have undetectable levels of oxygen. The potential effect on wine quality is a little bit higher during fermentation, especially if you have a whole lot of oxygen getting in. And this can be both good or bad. I say potential danger, but really it's a potential effect. Yeast, they don't need oxygen to metabolize, but they do need oxygen to grow. And the reason is that their cell membranes require unsaturated fatty acids. And to make unsaturated fatty acids, unless you're providing it for the yeast will need oxygen to make those. And so a common way then to speed up a slightly sluggish fermentation is to add oxygen in addition to other nutrients. And it's appropriate to think of oxygen as a fermentation nutrient. And so you can see here, if you spike in oxygen, you get this bump here, that's the fermentation rate going up as oxygen is introduced. That's the good side. The bad side, number one, is if you don't have a fermentation going on or it's really slow, now you've just introduced air and you can have aerobic spoilage happening. You can have other oxygen-loving microorganisms start to grow. But also oxygen will suppress formation of compounds that might be desirable, kind of lifestyle making. Oxygen's production of fruity smelling esters that give sort of fruit salad, banana, pear, tutti frutti type character to wines. That's wonderful if you're trying to make a fruity white wine or a fruity rosé or a Beaujolais Nouveau style wine. It increases production of fusel alcohols, which smell solvent-like. If you're trying to make fruity styles of wine, lots of air introduction is usually not what you want. And this is the reason why for whites and rosé production, it's very common then for fruity styles to do in stainless steel with minimal oxygen introduction. The fact that yeast consume oxygen also means that the threat of oxygen to the finished wine is lower as well. The yeast will consume that oxygen. There'll be changes, but it's probably not going to result in an undrinkable, commercially unacceptable wine. Okay, so now we're to the main part of the talk, which is you've got a finished wine, filtered, it's in tank. Now we're at the bulk storage part. You've got this finished wine and you introduce oxygen. What happens next? So there's a couple of pathways, and both of them don't involve enzymes anymore. Any residual enzymatic activity at the end of fermentation would have been, in most cases, removed following racking, would have been inactivated by sulfites, or would have been removed, enzymes or proteins would have been removed during bentonite fining if you were doing bentonite fining. And so within even an unfined wine, within a few months, there's minimal enzymatic activity if you've racked and filtered the wine. Okay, so this is where the potential danger of oxygen comes in. One of the big differences is, if you look at these relative reaction rates, um, if you add oxygen to a fermenting wine or to a freshly crushed grape must, that oxygen disappears within minutes. If you add oxygen to a finished wine with SO2, it's going to take days for that oxygen to decrease to a point where you can no longer measure it. We're at milligrams per liter per hour rather than milligrams per liter per minute, 100 times or more slower rates of oxygen consumption. So these, the role of oxygen is twofold. One is the impact on microorganisms. There's a number of organisms that require both the presence of oxygen or the absence of SO2, and those two go hand in hand to grow. And so the list is long. It's even longer if this is beer, but it's long for wine. We have film yeast as a possibility, acetic acid bacteria is a possibility, lactics is a possibility, Brettanomyces is a possibility, and other Saccharomyces too, especially if you have a sweet wine and residual sugar. And these can lead to off flavors, they can lead to haze formation, they can lead to re-fermentation for sweet wines. This can create regulatory issues like high levels of volatile acidity if you've got film yeast and lactics and acetobacter and Brett. What slows microbial growth is partly the absence of oxygen, but also the presence of molecular SO2, specifically the molecular SO2 fraction of SO2. The other class of changes are those that don't require microorganisms. These are chemical changes. These are referred to broadly as oxidation, although it's a number of different reactions. And these can lead to the outcomes that we associate with oxidation, like we see here in the bottom right. Wines that start off more yellow and end up more brown. This is going to cause browning, visible browning. These will cause oxidized aromas. They'll also cause the loss of aroma compounds that are sensitive to air, that can react with oxidation products, or occasionally directly with oxygen, but more commonly with byproducts of oxidation. And what slows down chemical oxidation, and the tool available to winemakers, is primarily the free SO2 fraction. Okay, so molecular SO2, free SO2. Some quick terminology. So this is where we finally start talking about pH. If you add SO2 to wine, and this can be done as a gas or it can be in the form of potassium metabisulfite, most of that SO2 doesn't stay as SO2. Instead, it becomes mostly this species here, bisulfite, HSO3 minus. And these arrows here, it's going back and forth. It's an equilibrium with a little bit, small percentage of molecular SO2. And one of these, bisulfite, is charged and non-volatile, and this other species, SO2, is volatile. And that small percentage, it's usually less than 5%. The lower the pH, the more of this molecular SO2 form we have. So comparing pH 3.4 to 2.8, that might seem a little low for you. I speak to producers of Riesling frequently who are operating in that pH range. And at that lower pH, we have a higher proportion of our sulfites in the presence, in the form of molecular SO2. Okay, so free SO2 won't stay just as free SO2. It can then further react with, got this one word here, binder. This term binder is describing dozens of different chemicals in wine that have the ability to bind up bisulfite. And so a portion of this free SO2 is going to end up bound to bisulfite. That bound form, it has less, possibly negligible, antimicrobial activity. It has less, again, possibly negligible antioxidant activity, but it's also in equilibrium with the free form. So that's interesting. It can act as a reservoir to partially replenish free SO2 once free SO2 gets lost. So the sum of all of these, that's total SO2. That's what gets regulated by the TTB. And the reason is, from a health perspective, when you ingest these, even the bound form, once it hits your stomach, gets diluted, lower pH, that's going to dissociate. and it's going to have the same physiological effect as free SO2. So total SO2 matters from a regulatory standpoint, but the free forms, and especially the free bisulfite form and the free molecular form, that's what we're going to care about for antioxidant and antimicrobial activity. So as examples of what can bind up SO2, this is a long list. This is not complete. Main binder in most wines, what gives sherry its characteristic sherry-like aroma, it's the oxidized form of ethanol, acetaldehyde, the smell of bruised apples and walnuts and sherry, but also other other odorous aldehydes, methional, the smell of baked potato. In sweet wines, glucose. So generally with sweet wines, we need to add more SO2 to stabilize, both because we're concerned about yeast spoilage and re-fermentation, because glucose is going to partially bind up some of the SO2 that we had. And then anthocyanins, which we're going to find in red wines, are also going to be a binder of sulfites that are added. And so once these compounds get up, it changes their properties. For example, these aroma compounds, these oxidized odors, if they're bound up to SO2, they don't have an odor anymore. They're non-volatile. We can't smell them. So this is a useful tool for a winemaker, especially at the end of a fermentation. The wines often have like kind of this slightly yeasty, even slightly oxidized smell. A little bit of SO2 can help freshen up that wine at the end of fermentation. Okay, so the molecular fraction of SO2, this is the neutral form. This is what is able to get inside of a yeast cell and kill it. And this is the antimicrobial form. Bisulfite is charged. It's not able to get inside the cell. But SO2 in the neutral form can, and once it's inside the cell, it seems to then become bisulfite again and then react with a number of different things inside the cell to exert its effect. There's a large number of recommendations in the literature. Depending on which country you're in, you get a different recommendation for your target molecular SO2 values. The reason we can have such a range of recommended values is because the relative efficacy of SO2 depends on other factors such as how much ethanol is in the wine, what specific strain of yeast are you using, what's the ionic strength, that is the mineral content. There's a number of other factors, and so I prefer to state ranges. And what I suggest is if you keep getting burned, go to the higher end of that range. But if it's working for you and you're happy, then don't change anything. Typical ranges for sweet wines are on the order of 0.8 to 1.2 milligrams per liter for wines that are risk for re-fermentation by Saccharomyces cerevisiae, because wine yeasts are more SO2 tolerant. Typical recommendations for dry wines are more like 0.4 to 0.4 to 0.6 milligrams per liter. If you swear that 0.3 is working for you and it's working for decades, that's fine. These are ballpark recommendations. It's not like yeast refuse to grow at 0.3, at 0.4, but definitely grow at 0.39. It's a continuum. It's not a sharp step function for a cutoff. Constraint. You don't want molecular too high because then it's going to singe your nostrils. The sensory threshold for molecular SO2, that is the average person can detect molecular SO2 at 2 milligrams per liter, but that's 50% of the population. There are plenty of people who can detect molecular SO2 at 1 milligram per liter or even less. So if you find that your customers are complaining about molecular SO2, about having an irritating character and you can detect it, even if you're not at 2, it may still be causing that burning struck match, irritating odor we associate with SO2. High SO2 can also inhibit malolactic. Generally, you're not going to be sulfiting wines a lot prior to malolactic fermentation. Okay, and usually you're going to be adjusting your molecular SO2 based on your free SO2 value and your pH. You pick your target molecular SO2, say 0.8 or 0.6, and then there's lookup tables that you can then use based on your pH to figure out how much free SO2 you need. There's also calculators online or print versions, and they come in various forms. But generally, it starts with determining your target molecular, and then your pH, and then figuring out how much free SO2 you're going to need to achieve that. One caveat, and this one doesn't show up in very many talks, but it's worth mentioning, especially if you're doing sweet reds. All standard methods for measuring SO2 badly overestimate free and molecular. Doesn't matter if you're doing Ripper or AO or flow injection, other methods that are available. They all overestimate free and molecular SO2 by a factor of, on the average, a factor of 3. And this is because SO2 binds anthocyanins. And when you do the initial step of SO2 analysis, which eventually involve a big pH adjustment, either you acidify or bring the pH way up if you're doing total, but you would acidify for doing free for both Ripper and AO and flow injection and other methods. You are going to then measure that released SO2. And as a result, the true value of molecular SO2 in your red wines is probably about a third what you think it is. If it's a dry wine, no big deal. You probably still have enough to stabilize that wine, unless you've got a whole lot of Brett pressure in your winery. If it's a sweet wine, I'm more concerned about re-fermentation. And I would strongly recommend doing some additional steps like Velcro or sterile filtration, because the SO2 is not going to be providing that protection. Okay, so that's the microbial side. Chemically, what happens if we don't have microorganisms? Two big pathways. There's lots of steps. I think what's more important here, that rather than all the steps that go into this, is the outcomes. Oxygen comes in, it reacts with metals and some other wine components. It's the downstream effects. Once you have these initial steps, you can get further reactions that cause most of the changes with wine. Oxygen does not react with most wine components. Instead, the byproducts of wine oxidation react with wine components and do things like result in the loss of sulfur compounds that can contribute to the aroma of a lot of wines. Both bad aromas like rotten egg smell, reduction like cabbage, but also desirable aromas like the Sauvignon Blanc aroma of passion fruit or grapefruit. It's also found in a number of other whites and rosés and even some reds. It contributes to fruitiness. This is going to be lost through oxidation, or I should say reaction with oxidation products. Browning reactions, formation of aldehydes and oxidized aromas, but some good things too, like formation of stable wine pigments. So these are all going to come about usually not due to direct reaction with oxygen, but rather due to downstream reactions involving the products of oxidation. So one of the key things with this is that oxidation is not necessarily always bad. A little bit of oxygen is well known to improve the quality of certain types of wine. And with red wines in particular, there's good work showing that you can get a modest improvement in terms of increasing stable wine pigment. It's also called polymeric pigment. You can also show modest decreases in astringency as well. The impact, it's pretty consistent. People can show it. These are not huge compared to some other strategies. Note that for increasing polymeric pigment, look at the axis here, you've got about a 20% increase. This is not the same as trying a new grape variety. If you go from Pinot to, say, Marquette, you're getting a much bigger increase in the amount of pigment that you're going to have in that wine. But it's still a modest reproducible effect, and it's a tool that you have to try to make more stable color or to try to decrease astringency. Okay, so the role of free SO2 is to counteract the effects of oxygen on a wine. Usually this is not going to involve direct reaction with with oxygen. Sulfites do not react rapidly with oxygen. They instead consume oxidation products. So a typical recommendation for SO2, free SO2 in a wine, again, pick your textbook, pick your country. Typically what's recommended at packaging is somewhere between 20 to 40 milligrams per liter and similar concentrations during bulk storage. Key thing here, free, not molecular. Two separate constraints, one for molecular for preventing microbial spoilage, another free SO2 for preventing oxidative spoilage. 20 to 40, it would be higher probably if you know that you're going to have a container, and that can be a bottle, that can also be a tank, that's going to have more oxygen ingress. So if you've got a variable volume tank and you're concerned about how much oxygen is getting in, that might be a reason both to check more frequently for SO2 concentration, but also to start with a higher concentration, knowing you're going to be losing faster. So the reason for these targets, in a finished wine, in sensory evaluations, once SO2, free SO2 gets below around 10 milligrams per liter, that's usually when oxidized aromas start to become apparent. And also, once you get much below 10 milligrams per liter, there's a pretty good chance that your molecular SO2 is also too low. But the big concern for free SO2 is oxidized aromas, and eventually oxidized color as well. As long as free SO2 is above 10, this is less likely to occur. The role of free SO2 is not to react with oxygen. Rather, the main role is to scavenge and to react with products of oxygen. The rule of thumb is that we should expect that 4 milligrams per liter of total SO2 will get lost for every 1 milligram per liter of oxygen that's consumed. This typically means that the loss in free SO2 will be a little bit less because we have some of the bound pool that's going to act as a reservoir and replenish free SO2. So usually what I expect to see is if we lose a milligram per liter of oxygen, we should lose 2 to 3 milligrams per liter of free SO2. How much is a milligram per liter? Again, saturation, shake, 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 shake. You bubble air through a tank. You would expect to have that about 8 milligrams per liter to 10 milligrams per liter of oxygen. That's a loss then of around 20 to 30 or so milligrams per liter free SO2. 20 to 30 milligrams. That is probably all your SO2 that you had in that wine if you were to completely saturate that tank with air. Chris will talk more about oxygen management and how not to get to that circumstance. If you don't have good headspace control or good control of your seals, to end up in a situation where you can lose all of your free SO2 over the course of weeks. So eventually this wine is going to start smelling oxidized. And this can be because you make new oxidized aroma compounds. Interestingly, the main source of oxidized aromas doesn't seem to be making new oxidized smelling compounds, at least not at first. Rather, the first step seems to be releasing some of these bound SO2 forms, which have no smell when they're bound up, but once they get freed up, then they start smelling oxidized. Walnuts, baked potatoes, soy sauce, cardboard, all the things that we associate with oxidation. Okay, so quick review. We have the antimicrobial component of SO2. We have the antioxidant component of SO2. Our targets for antimicrobial are going to be between 0.4 and 1.2 milligrams per liter. Our targets for antioxidant are going to be more like, well, more than 10, but more commonly 20 to 40 milligrams per liter of free SO2. And I say bottling, but really that's any kind of storage that you're doing. That'd be a typical target. And this is, of all the things that are hard to replace for SO2, this is the hardest function to replace. There's other ways to stabilize wines so that they don't spoil microbially. It's really hard to find a good replacement for the antioxidant role of SO2. I have a few more things, but I'm looking at the time, and I think, Chris, this would be a good time to switch over to your talk.
Thank you, Gavin. You made it on time. Good job.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I need to stop sharing also. Otherwise, oh wait, did you do it for me? No, I didn't know.
No.
Okay.
Drew, do you want to introduce Chris? We don't hear you, Drew.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Chris, I can hear you, but I don't hear Drew.
Oh.
Sorry, I must have leaned on my
it works.
leaned on my button here. Sorry about that. Double muted. All right, sorry about that. We're glad to have both of you here, both Gavin and Chris. Chris Gerling is a senior extension associate in the Department of Food Science at Cornell Agritech in Geneva, New York. He works with craft beverage industry to create educational programs that support the growth and improved quality of premium wines, ciders, and distilled spirits. He's also the manager of the Vinification and Brewing Technology Lab, where fermentations are conducted for research projects and applied trials, and the Cornell Craft Beverage Analysis Lab, where products can be submitted for troubleshooting, routine analysis, or sensory appraisal. He also organizes and conducts workshops and seminars that focus on production and analytical techniques for farm-based beverages. Chris is a busy guy. He's a past chair of the American Society of Enology and Viticulture Eastern Section, and also serves on the American Society of Enology and Viticulture's National Chapter's Laboratory Proficiency Committee. He's also a member of the Cider Institute of North America's Executive Committee. Again, one of the busiest men in the wine research business, Chris Gerling. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks. Sorry, I can't. Once the screen is up, I can't see you. So yeah. All right. I think my screen is up. I think you can hear me. Here we go. All right. So we're talking a little about headspace. We're not going to talk about foot space that much, although foot space is important, as you can see in that picture, and some of the outcomes that we can try to avoid when we're managing our headspace, and yeah, including cool filmies that look like brains. So the first thing is, do we need headspace? Is headspace something we have to deal with all the time? And of course, during fermentation, we have to have headspace, or we can have disastrous results, as you can see from this, I think it's Prosecco on the right. But once fermentation is over, we really don't want headspace. And so as much as we may sometimes need to manage it, ideally we'd like to eliminate it. This is from an OSHA, NIOSH strategy, talking about the hierarchy of controls. And the idea is that if you've got something that's a problem, the most effective way to deal with that problem is to eliminate it from the situation. And if you can do that, then you don't have a lot of risks associated with your management strategies. And so as the further we go down this pyramid, the less control we have, the less effective our management is, the more risks we have, the more management it takes, et cetera. And so this is probably fairly common sense to all of you and fairly obvious, but if we don't have headspace, then we don't have to deal with it. We don't have to deal with the measurements and the checks and all the things going that are going to be necessary. I'm going to talk about a little bit more to deal with that headspace. So ideally, we'd like to, once fermentation is complete, we'd like to not have headspace. As Gavin mentioned, we have one major tool in our arsenal to deal with the inevitable oxygen ingress and less than perfect storage conditions we'll have to deal with, either for a short time or for longer, but hopefully not. And that big tool is sulfur dioxide, is SO2. And as Gavin mentioned, it's very effective at preventing both oxidation and microbial growth. And we have some substances out there that can do both of these things. That can do one of these things. We have very few. If there's probably nothing that can do both of these things. There's definitely nothing that can do both of these things as well as SO2 does. And so that's why we use that in our battle against oxygen and microbial growth. The thing about SO2 is that it prevents problems, right? It does not correct them, with the slight exception of the minor oxidative qualities that Gavin was talking about. Otherwise, it's not going to kind of fix problems. If we have bad smells or serious oxidation, SO2 is not going to fix these problems. And so that's why I liken it to a barn door. When the barn door is closed, then the animals can't get out. Once it's open, closing the doors is not going to solve the problem if the animals are already out, right? So it's our preventive. It's not a solution. And so we just have to keep that in mind as we're managing the process. And the other thing that I think Gavin also mentioned, but we're going to keep hitting on here, is that throughout the process, we can manage SO2. We can measure it, we can check it, and we can add more if we need to, up to a certain point, up to our limits, hopefully far below those limits. But for the most part, we can manage it until we get to putting it into a bottle or a can or finished container. And then after that, we've lost the ability to manage it further. So our best case scenario is that we have not necessarily clear eyes, full hearts, but we have appropriate SO2 levels and full tanks. And if that's our case, then we are in very good shape, and we don't have to worry about a lot of this other stuff, or at least not for long periods of time. You can leave things secure in the knowledge that there's not a very high probability of a problem arising from that headspace. Just talking about, I got this email today, so I thought I would throw it in. A lot of the companies are now showing you ways if you want to lower your SO2 use. Maybe you're putting your product in cans, and Gavin can talk to you a lot about the risks of cans and why we have to lower SO2 when we're canning. But for a variety of reasons, people try to kind of replace SO2 or minimize their SO2 use, and it's possible, but this is just through fermentation, and there's 5 steps, and each step, or not all steps, but many steps have multiple products you're adding. And the point of all this is to do what SO2 does. To replace it is complicated, imperfect, and not ideal. And so if we can avoid, if we can just use SO2 the right way, appropriately, it's a lot simpler than some of these other strategies. So the first thing we can consider when we're trying to manage our headspace and minimize it is the shape of the tank. And so you see the tank on the right is a perfect cylinder. And so if there's any level of headspace in that wooden tank on the right, that surface area is the entire diameter of the tank. And so that's not great if we can avoid that. So on the left, you can see that if there's a little bit of headspace at the very top of the tank, there's much less surface area that's exposed. And so there's much less room for air to get in. There's much less opportunity for a film yeast to form. If a film yeast did form, heaven forbid, it's a much smaller surface area that film yeast can cover. And so we have much less kind of danger from all the problems that headspace can present to us. And so if we have the right shape of a tank, that's a good first step, and that's ideal. The other thing about this is these tanks are, we'll talk more about this. The next thing to consider is the material of the tank. Obviously, headspace prevention is one thing. Oxygen ingress through the material is another. And so stainless steel is going to prevent oxygen ingress. Wood allows a certain amount of ingress that some people can consider is appropriate, depending on the wine you're trying to make. If you're trying to make a red wine or Chardonnay or some certain kinds of wine, a little bit of oxygen ingress seems to be appropriate to our understanding of those wines, and so we're not as afraid of it. If we're trying to make a Sauvignon Blanc, if we're trying to make rosé, then we'd like as much ingress as possible. Over here we have a plastic tank. For the longest time, plastic tank manufacturers tried to say that there was no oxygen ingress. Eventually they got smart marketing, and they realized that they could say, this ingress is the same as the barrel next to it. You think that barrels are good, so why don't you think this is good? Which is, I think, pretty clever. But the point is that there will be ingress in materials other than stainless steel, and so that's something to keep in mind. So if you've got a tank that's less than full, there's opportunities for headspace issues there, and then also kind of in through the tank itself. So that compounds your problem. And so the message is to keep your tank, especially be concerned about keeping your tank full if you are using a material other than stainless steel, because the risks are that much greater. And so if you can't control ingress one way, then try to control it the other. We have to consider all of our operations as we go through the winemaking process. Every time we rack or if we filter, obviously cold stabilization, finding all these things, we are going to be creating some solids in the tank. We are going to be generating, we're going to be having some kind of sediment at the bottom. And that means that when we separate that sediment, we are creating there's loss. And so the tank is going to, the next tank we go into is going to, you know, if it's the same size tank, it won't be full anymore, which is not necessarily a mind-blowing sentiment, but it's something we need to plan for. And so ideally, we can use different size tanks, and we can, if you've calculated kind of what your losses are, when you're buying tanks, you start to think about how you can plan that so that you can step down to smaller tanks, or perhaps you can keep an appropriate kind of wine on hand to add to fill in that headspace. Ideally, best case scenario, you have something to blend so the tank is full again after this process. And of course, there is a solution, or at least there's a Band-Aid, in my opinion, that you can use if you are looking to fill space. If you have no option, if you can't fill the tank and you're going to have to keep it that way, what everyone you've heard about is inert gas and gas blanketing. And so using a gas that is heavier than oxygen to create a blanket between the top of the wine and the tank or the headspace is an option. And so people talk about, CO2 is a gas that you can obviously use in winemaking for lots of reasons. And it's also used for carbonation, which is the first indication that it's not necessarily ideal in this situation, because some of it is going to absorb into the wine. You're going to carbonate your wine ever so slightly, and that means you're losing your blanket if you're using carbon dioxide for this purpose. Nitrogen is more inert and can be a good solution as well, and can create that blanket. And then finally, a lot of people talk about argon. The thing that I have to mention about argon is the reason there's no writing here is because argon is not mentioned in the Code of Federal Regulations list of wine treating materials, like carbon dioxide and nitrogen are listed. So argon is, in technical terms, not strictly legal because it's not listed as an approved wine treating material. You could argue about whether or not it's actually treating the wine or it's ever touching the wine, all these kind of things. But just to keep in mind, argon is not listed, and so I'm not sure what your risk is of trouble with a TTB there, but just be aware that's the case. So nitrogen is probably, is the preferred one, all things considered in this case. But I know that many people use argon, and I've never heard of anybody getting in trouble using argon. So, but be aware. So the way we can get around headspace, of course, if we don't have lots of tanks of lots of different sizes, is to use variable capacity tanks. Variable capacity tanks can obviously, the lid slides, the floating lid can slide up and down, and so your tank can always be full. And so this gets around this problem of having to carefully plan out all of our sizes of tanks. If we're a small winery, we don't have a lot of different tanks, or your production is variable, all these different reasons, this can solve the problem. The thing is, I call this still headspace management versus elimination, because these lids have to be managed. Anybody who's used them for any length of time knows it's hard to count on that seal. As you can see, the shape of the tank means that if you have the lid anywhere above your wine, then the full diameter, the full surface of the wine is exposed. That is headspace. So you have to keep on it. You want to keep the lid right down on the wine to the best extent you can. And that creates all other issues in terms of sanitation with that gasket, and just always having to manage that pressure, making sure everything is okay. And so, yeah, you can make sure your tank is always full, but it is something you still have to manage. And so be aware of that. It's a solution. It's not necessarily a foolproof, easy solution, I guess. There are bags. Just like you can have a bag and box, you can buy a box wine. You can use bags for production. There are some available during fermentation. There are some available during storage. And once again, the thing about a bag is you can make it so it's always full. It's usually for smaller producers, but there are options out there just in case you're curious. We were talking about barrels, managing barrels. there are differing schools of thought on how to manage barrels. Some people say, I get a good vacuum, it's nice and cool, I know that it's relatively stable, and I'm just going to leave it alone for a couple months. Other people are nervous about leaving barrels alone. They've had issues, and they want to keep on top of them. The thing about frequent sampling is that every time you open and every time you sample, that's an opportunity for oxygen ingress, obviously, and also contamination. And so if you're going to be frequently sampling to keep on top of things, it's not a bad thing, but make sure you're doing it right. Make sure that you're using good protocols. Make sure you have some way of cleaning your sampling if you're sampling barrel to barrel to barrel. If you don't clean in between sampling or sanitize, even better, you are potentially inoculating barrel to barrel. And so that's something we want to avoid if we can. So something like a good thermos with the hottest water you can possibly have in that thermos, like 180 degrees and higher would be greater, so would be ideal. So you can dip the wine thief in between. Something like that is a good idea. And then just making sure that you're checking everything and keeping those seals really good in between the sampling times, and not, we went to sample 4 barrels and we left the bungs out of 2 or whatever, because you made the problem worse than trying to monitor it. When we are doing transfer operations, we do need to keep in mind that there could be pinholes, and those pinholes can pull air. That's the Venturi effect, it's called. It's kind of like the principle of a jet engine. It's pressure differentials with liquid movements, gas and liquid. Gas is a liquid as well. Or behaves like one. And as Gavin mentioned, we're probably not, if you're going to be doing something that's going to take an hour or something like that, you're probably don't have to be super hyper vigilant about blanketing everything before and blanketing everything after and pushing through it, everything like that. I mean, you want to be careful. You don't want to do a lot of splashing. It doesn't hurt necessarily to create these gas blankets, but if your SO2 is okay and you're going to check your SO2 and manage it, then it's not something that you have to be super, super vigilant about all the time. In my opinion, I'd be much more concerned with just getting the big things right, that we're making sure SO2 is adequate. We're making sure that our tanks are full at the beginning and at the end, all those things, rather than messing around with the gas during this process. But watch for leaks, make sure all your clamps are tight and your gaskets are good and all that kind of stuff, so you're not pulling air. And you can there's ways you can tell, you can listen, you can see bubbling, things like that give you an indication that maybe you're pulling air. You're doing that. When you do get to bottling, at whatever scale you're at, whether you're doing it, tabletop or you have a huge operation, this is where it gets serious. As Gavin said, you can't add more SO2 to a corked bottle, right? I mean, you can, but holy cow, that's not going to be fun. So we want to make sure that we're in control of SO2 at this point. And so this is where, as Gavin said, we can measure our loss potentially during bottling, so we can be aware if we are having oxygen ingress and then SO2 loss associated with it, if we can maybe bump our SO2 up a little bit to account for that loss. Obviously, we'd like to minimize the loss on the one end, but if it's not something you can really control easily, then that's a good time to bump the SO2 a little bit and to prepare for that loss. And then finally, this might be a time for inert gas in the tank you're emptying. If the tank is sitting empty for is emptying 4 hours, and it's going to be very low. There's going to be lots of headspace as you get to a third of the tank full, a quarter of the tank full. Now you've got a lot of headspace. If it's sitting there for many hours, depending on how long it takes you to bottle, that can be a time to start to think about backing up with some inert gas. Finally, we just want to SO2 management and headspace management go together, as we've been talking about all today. So we want to make sure we're measuring and our pH, as Gavin explained, and our SO2, because they go together, calculating our addition, and then checking to make sure it's stable. As something that, in some situations, it may not be stable and you may be losing it, and that's something to be aware of. And so it's good to this is the best case scenario, best practices is to just make sure that it's stable. And hopefully the decrease is this in the case, this is what we're doing after we've had a decrease of greater than 5, is why we're doing this. And so if you're going into a full stainless steel tank, now you're good. And you can go a month, maybe more, without worrying about it. If you are in a variable capacity tank, a plastic tank, something, container that's not completely full, all this kind of stuff, we're going to want to check SO2 more often because we just have more reasons to suspect loss. And I'm not saying that you personally have this on hand, but this is what we see most of the time. All right, so in summary, avoiding headspace is better than managing it whenever we can. SO2 is going to need to be managed in concert with this, and at least until we get to bottling, as long as we can keep the SO2 in there, as Gavin showed, then those oxidation products can be dealt with. And the less SO2 we can use, the better. We obviously have our limits, and we'd like to keep our use to what we absolutely need. So it's always best to minimize this, but SO2 can't help you until you get to packaging when that's your last chance. And that's it, I think, for now.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Chris. To our attendees, to the people watching, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box there on the lower right of your screen. We are now going to be joined by two great Iowa winemakers, Dorothy O'Brien from Wide River Winery and Kevin Fifo from Covered Bridges Winery to help answer any questions or just to have a sort of a discussion, conversation about what we just learned in these two presentations. Do we have any questions posted in the chat box?
So we had one, and it seemed that the chat box for everybody doesn't work really well. So you can direct your question to the direct chat. It still works. So one question is about, do you know if any affordable Coravin type of product exists for testing through a barrel bung? Maybe, Chris, that's for you.
I don't know of anything. No, I don't know of anything. Oh, Gavin, are you? Oh,
I'm looking.
Sorry, I'm muted. I'm muted. I'm sorry. Yeah, I said no. Go patent it, Vanessa. Yeah, I mean, like cannula for, yeah, I mean, it'd be a cannula device for going through something of the geometry of a barrel bung rather than a cork. No, I'm trying to think like what is the one thing that occurs to me is you'd be repeatedly sampling through the same spot and you do have less oxygen ingress. You'd be trying to backfill as you did it. But yeah, I'm trying to think if you would end up with a barrel, you've got multiple spots where you can have oxygen getting in and leaving. So if you were to then put in inert gas, say, through like the Coravin type device, it wouldn't necessarily stay there in the same way that it would in a finished bottle, where there's really only one source of leaking. It's an interesting idea, but I look forward to seeing you on Shark Tank.
I mean, it'd be great if you have like the equivalent of like an IR thermometer, right? That you can just point at a tank or a barrel, whatever, and can give you all that stuff. And yeah,
what I have seen is dedicated sensors for the inside of barrel bungs. I haven't seen them widely adapted yet, probably because of the cost, but they'll measure pressure, oxygen, humidity. I'm not sure what you do with that number. And so you can use that to monitor barrel integrity, for example, because a barrel should draw a vacuum during storage if it's sound.
Be great if you could have a bung that was checking the free SO2 every hour or
even every
week.
That's the dream. I forget the bung.
It's gonna come one day.
Yeah, there's stuff reported in the literature. I haven't seen anything that's been robust enough for commercial use, because that's my dream, is a real-time sensor, just like a pH probe, basically, that you could go into a report and measure SO2 with all the other noise that's going on in the wine fermentation or storage.
Yeah. Thank you. Kevin, Dorothy, do you have any questions or any comments? How do you manage SO2 in your winery? Like, tell us a little bit more.
So I think Chris and Gavin pretty much covered everything. I mean, we have a combination of variable capacity tanks. We check those gaskets on a regular basis. We have some fixed tanks that have a pretty good shape to minimize any oxygen that would be at the top. If we have to, leave a fixed tank for a few days, without filling it up, topping it up, or changing to a smaller tank, we use argon. So don't turn me into the TTB. I mean, I think they covered it very well.
Yeah, I agree.
Right.
We're similar to Dorothy. Most everything is variable capacity. I do a blanket with argon, especially if I'm going to poly, then not completely filling it. It's a short-term solution. I try not to keep that for more than a couple of weeks. It's the get me to the next milestone that I can fully resolve that. Managing the variable capacity tanks is one of the biggest challenges. They're a necessary evil, I guess, with wineries of our capacity, and we're 6,000 to 8,000 gallons a year. But managing those gaskets, keeping them clean, keeping them as sanitary as you can is important. Watching those as you go through the change of season, as temperature changes in your winery, the pressure in those gaskets change. And despite the fact that it's stainless steel, it does move. So the pressures inside your tanks change. And that can be a positive change. And you start pressing wine out of the weakest spot in your seals, or a negative change, and you start bringing air into those tanks inadvertently. So keep an eye on those. We have processes where pretty much every spring and every fall, empty the gaskets and reseat them if they haven't already been moved, just to make sure that we're equalizing those pressures. Other than that, I tend to keep SO2 levels. I'll start them off fairly high. I'll be between maybe 1.5 and 2 molecular right after fermentation. Part of that is, I freely admit, I'm lazy. I don't like taking SO2 tests every month. And knowing that they're that high, and frankly, knowing that I'm not going to do anything with the wine, I'm not going to be blending it for many months, just cuts down on some of the maintenance. And keep an eye on that. In Gavin's presentation, I did not realize that sugar would bind SO2. So I think that's a good reminder of before you're sweetening or after you're sweetening your wines, making sure that you're checking for free as opposed to immediately before, because you're going to bind some and it's not going to be available. So I thought the presentations were great. At a minimum, great reminders for all of us. But I think everybody listening has picked up on a few key tidbits on how they can improve their own processes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, could I ask, Kevin, you shared your own approach to management, but also for testing protocols. And I've seen a broad range of strategies that are all successful in the industry for doing testing in terms of frequency, especially based on types of tanks. Could you tell me what is your management program for testing? How frequently do you test barrels or tanks? And does it depend on the type of container that you're using?
It does depend on the type of container. Stainless. If I know that I'm keeping the levels high, I'll check them about quarterly and make sure that things are good. I've got a titrator that helps speed that process up. Barrels is more frequently. I am topping those barrels up about once every 4 to 6 weeks because we're not storing our barrels in the best environment. It's a beautiful air-conditioned building and everything, but that tends to make the air dry, tends to increase the evaporation in the barrels. So I'm topping those up frequently. And then as we top them up, we'll check the SO2 real quick and make sure we're maintaining the appropriate levels. But even in those, I'm going to be on the high end of what your scale should be. That 1.2 to 1.4 range just for general storage.
Yeah, very interesting.
I have a quick question for both Chris and Gavin. I worked for a few years at a Gallo, a winemaking facility, and we did this what I call wonderful thing on every wine that we produce, red or white or in between. Once we were through fermentation, and that's for most whites and rosés, once you're through primary yeast fermentation. For dry reds, once you were through yeast fermentation and malolactic fermentation was complete, and you were going to put the wine into bulk storage, whatever that's a tank or a barrel, we would add the shock dose, typically 60 part per million of sulfur. Now, again, I remind our listeners, I don't mean bringing the wine up to 60 parts per million. I mean adding a post-fermentation, like you're shocking a swimming pool with chlorine, to sort of slam the door on any bacteria that may have snuck their way through fermentation. If the pH was higher than about 3.5, we'd probably do 70 part per million shock dose. And that sure set the wine up for at least the next 6 to 8 weeks in maturation storage conditions. Have either of you ever heard of that? Do you have any comment? Do you think that's a good protocol?
Yeah, just to clarify, this would be at the end of malolactic or the end of alcoholic, depending on so you're at dryness at this point or finished ML. You're not trying to stop a raging fermentation.
No, you're completely dry. Fermentation is dry. For whites, we're going to assume for whites and rosés, no ML. For reds, complete ML.
So I've not heard the term shock used as an adjective, but I think that and Chris, you can correct me if you've heard that before. But it is very common for that first addition to be on the ballpark of 50 to 70 ppm of milligrams per liter total SO2. And the reason is that about half of the SO2 that initially gets added gets bound up, and especially by acetaldehyde. That is, there's not very much of this, but this is the oxidized form of ethanol. There's inevitably a small amount of acetaldehyde, but by small, I mean 10, 20 milligrams per liter. That's going to bind 20 to 30 milligrams per liter of SO2. So to overcome that, you add 50 to 70 and you end up right around 30 to 40 free as a result. So that would be for that initial dose. Subsequent doses usually need less total SO2 addition to achieve a given free SO2 increase. For that first one, because of the acetaldehyde that's present, you do need to.
Good stuff.
Yeah, I agree with all that, both of you. Yeah, and that's and the concern I think is some people are like nervous or hesitant with their SO2 additions, and they're like, well, I'll just add like 20 parts, and then if it needs more, then I'll add more. And the problem is if you make a small addition there, then that could all be bound, as Gavin was talking about. And if it's all bound, then some of those reactions can keep occurring, more acetaldehyde, and you could make 4 additions of 20 parts over 6-8 weeks and never have any free and never build up that barrier of protection versus making the one addition going in all the way and actually establishing that barrier and stopping those reactions. So
yeah. And Kevin, that's a really interesting point that you made about being carefully if you're adding sugar right before bottling. That's sort of the other extreme of this is, okay, so has my I know where I started for SO2, but is that going to change? I'll add one further complication to that. Glucose can bind. Fructose does not bind very well to SO2. Sucrose does not. If you're adding cane sugar, table sugar, that won't bind immediately, but that'll hydrolyze during storage. And that means you can actually get binding during storage if you wait another few months. That glucose starts to go up, and then it can start binding. The percentages that I would start worrying about, if you're at a 2% RS, 3% RS, don't worry about it. If you're making things like 8% RS or more, that's when it starts becoming more important in terms of like a measurable loss of free SO2.
And that was a great point you made about temperature, seasonal changes and changes in volumes because of temperature and pressures because of temperature. So yeah.
I wonder how many of you have ever had the experience of going into a winery and seeing variable capacity tanks with their little pressure gauges on them, and the needle is up there in the green. It looks great, and you tap the gauge and the needle falls because it was stuck. And yes, the floating lid is free flow with a small cloud of fruit flies above it. Variable capacity tanks are my pet peeve. And so, Chris, I'm super happy that you made all those comments about managing those damn variable capacity tanks. I tell people, you literally every day when you walk in, physically tap on the lid to make sure it's not loose. Don't even trust the darn gauge. And by all means, in between uses, take them all apart. Take the vent off, take the gasket off, take the hoses off, put them away, clean and sanitized, re-clean them and sanitize before you put them back on. And yes, people who say, well, I don't want the lid to touch, so I'm going to leave a little gap between the surface and the lid itself, keeps me up at night. And it's not even my wine, but I love wine that much. I hate to see good wine go bad.
And do we know for the plastic tanks how much oxygen ingress happens? Even though the company says nothing is happening between the outside and the inside of the tank, but as you mentioned, Chris, there is something going on. Like oxygen is still gonna go in.
Some of those tanks they say they have a rate for the plastics transmission of oxygen, and you can get them quickly absorbing for red wines and not so quickly absorbing for whites. So sometimes the manufacturers actually will tell you what the rate of oxygen uptake is.
I have a quick question about wines in cans or sparkling wines. How much SO2 do you need to be concerned about, or how much SO2 do you need to use when you have carbon dioxide?
Yeah.
Because carbon dioxide is going to protect in some ways.
Yeah. And so
can you
the
talk
reason,
a little bit more?
Yeah, the reason you bring this up, Ode, is because SO2 is able to bypass the liner and react the aluminum to make hydrogen sulfide. So we caution people to try to keep their molecular SO2 below 0.5 milligrams per liter to get about 6 months shelf life for canned wine. So then the question is, okay, well, how low can we get, especially if we've got a low pH wine and we're already struggling to keep our molecular SO2 low. So I just completed a tasting with some winemakers, and they've got a range of strategies for their canned wines. We tried several wines that had free SO2 as low as 5 to 10 milligrams per liter in the finished canned wine, and because the can is an amazing hermetic seal. We don't worry about any air getting in. And if you have a sparkling product, that means during canning, it's very easy to manage headspace. You're not going to get much oxygen in. So what I recommend that people do if they're thinking about doing this with canned wine production, Chris, you can't legally add hydrogen peroxide in the United States. However, you can test with it. So using peroxide, start removing, you have your free SO2 at say 20-25, start removing a little bit of that SO2. Peroxide will rapidly react with SO2. Wait a bit, let it equilibrate. Get down to that 5 to 10 area. Smell the wine. What do you think? Are you noticing oxidized aromas? If the wine still smells fine after equilibrating for a week or so, then I'm pretty confident that it's going to be good in the can. If once you get to say 2, I don't think there's a single wine out there once you get below 2 milligrams per liter free where you're not going to smell something aldehydic. But there's most certainly wines between 5 to 10 that'll be just fine. And I don't know any other way to figure it out other than empirically. Just try it, bring it down to that level. a small amount, it's not really a true bench trial. You're still going to put it in storage for a while to equilibrate, but see what you think. If you like it, good. You can put it into package that way. Oh, and work with a good canner who's got good headspace control.
Yep.
I wish
right,
I wish we could come up with more wine grapes that produce lower pH wines.
That would
That's
help.
I always
Yeah.
I always tell winemakers when they're bemoaning the high acidity that, well, it's not always a bad thing. Higher acidity, lower pH, much more stable, much more long-term stable, et cetera, et cetera. So besides, that's why it's legal to add a little bit of water. I always remind people. Some people think it's cheating. Whether it's Minnesota or California, I've added plenty of water to wine through the years.
We're not telling people about argon, then we're not telling people about water. Water actually is there actually are regulations to allow water addition. So
yeah. If your acid's above 5 grams per liter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to also say when you were talking about CO2 and nitrogen, CO2 of course doesn't last as long. Nitrogen lasts a bit longer. Argon lasts a long time. But you didn't, because you were talking about oxygen at one point. There's a wonderful also another function of nitrogen besides just blanketing wines. That is, of course, using it to sparge to strip out excess, either excess CO2 or excess O2. And I've even managed to, at very low PSIs, use nitrogen to sort of push all the end of the wine through a plate and frame filter. And then once I hear the tank, the nitrogen bubbling through the tank, let it go for 2 or 3 minutes, knowing that not only am I creating a blanket, but I'm stripping some CO2 and some oxygen out at the same time. Nitrogen's wonderful stuff.
Oh. Any more questions or comments?
I think we got an answer to the question of what kind of SO2 levels work in canned wine. But did you answer the question about what kind of SO2 levels if we're bottling sparkling wine or kegging sparkling wine?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So this actually I can just to see if you have some knowledge. Know that so from an antimicrobial standpoint, carbonation is antimicrobial as well. And so that, at least in principle, for preventing carbonation, is going to it's going to provide antimicrobial. Furthermore, if you're doing methane champenois, and while you have that still on the lees are going to act as an oxygen scavenger. So if we're looking now at finished wine, how much SO2 for sparkling. The role of the carbonation is it does not slow down the rate of oxidation. What it's going to do is make it easier to bottle with minimal oxygen pickup. So the amount of the oxygen you would have in the headspace or in that wine is going to be lower than you would probably have with your still wines. It's not going to, if you had the same amount of oxygen get into the wine, it would not impede that rate of oxidation. So then the question is, okay, so then this is under pressure. Does the CO2 somehow prevent oxygen from getting in once you have a finished stabilized wine? I understand intuitively it feels like the carbon dioxide in the wine is going to make a wall that would then prevent O2 from getting in. If you get down to the molecular level and you look around your oxygen, it's a lot of empty space. Gases are mostly just nothing, and as opposed to liquids where there's very little empty space. With gases, oxygen's wandering around, diffusing its way into the bottle. It looks around. It actually probably isn't going to be seeing very many CO2 molecules as it goes. Gases are mostly empty space. I don't think it's going to actually affect the rate of oxygen ingress that much. That's based on work done with beer and crown caps, showing the rate of oxygen ingress with a crown cap with carbonated beverages is not affected by the carbon dioxide. which does not feel intuitive, right? The CO2 is pushing it out. Once you're at equilibrium, there's actually not a whole lot of CO2 to prevent that. If you're sparging a tank with large volumes of gas, now you've got a wave of CO2 that's doing the pushing. So I think the short answer is no. It's your finished your SO2 for preventing oxidation is going to be similar to what you would target with a still wine, except for the concern about oxidation being probably lower because you've got less headspace oxygen.
Because can you measure dissolved oxygen in a carbonated wine? Same as beer? Not really, right?
Well, you could use a dissolved oxygen. Do you mean you wouldn't go through the screw cap? Is that your question?
Yeah, but if you just want to have a measurement of dissolved oxygen using the same probe as usual.
Did you have to degas it
Is that
before
going
you
to
test
work
it?
with the
No.
carbon dioxide, like the bubbles? No.
No, what you could do is you could use one of those, you could use the fluorescence sensors if you cared, although that would just be for a single bottle. But I mean, the probes are not just measuring pressure, the probes are measuring oxygen selectively. They're redox probes. So, but it would be a little tricky to do. You have to decant. I don't know, could you drop it right in? I think you could probably drop it right in, except it's not very big, that opening on a bottle.
Okay.
Some of them are skinny probes. So you could measure oxygen, yes, it would be a little trickier than in a tank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right.
I'm sorry, I gave a very long answer. Bottle
No,
your
it's good.
sparkling wine with roughly the same amount of SO2 as your still wines, but take into account that you might not be losing as much SO2 due to oxidation.
I was going to say 25.
Perfect. That's always the right answer.
Short answer.
I worked for a winemaker that was it. Everything 25. Get on with it. Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
yeah, with the consideration of sparkling wine, it probably is a lower pH because of the grapes are usually picked less ripe. That's all the things Gavin said that you could probably get away with. But yeah, a little bit lower than usual, but not much is the
Yeah.
Or 25. One of those.
Well, I want to wish everybody a happy harvest.
Mm-hmm.
And
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, I hope everybody be healthy and safe. Don't walk backwards. And no roughhousing or horseplay in the cellar.
That's a good final note, Drew.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
I'll
you
drink to
very
that.
much
Yeah.
to our great presenters. So Gavin and Chris, thanks very much for your awesome presentations. We didn't have a lot of questions, but that's because you did an awesome job explaining everything. Thanks, Dorothy and Kevin, just to be with us and bringing your experience and asking some questions. That's really useful. So we hope you really enjoy the webinar today and you learn new skills that you will hopefully be using this upcoming season. Once again, as Drew mentioned, have a good harvest season, winemaking season. It's going to be busy, but it's going to be good. So if you want to watch the recordings of the previous webinars, you can scan the QR code. You will also receive an email with the link to access that YouTube channel. And if you have other questions, feel free to contact me or Drew or any of the presenters. And on that note, yeah, have a good season. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Au revoir.